If you enjoyed this interesting video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you even more exciting and thought-provoking content. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Join our growing community today. Your feedback, comments, and ideas truly keep this channel alive.
The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 1, A Scholar is Born. In the mid-18th century, in the land of Gober in present-day northern Nigeria, a child was born into a Fulani family whose heritage was deeply rooted in learning and faith. That child, Usman Dan Fodio, would grow to become one of the most influential leaders in African history. His story is not just about battles and conquests, but about belief, vision, and the power of one man's voice to transform nations. From the beginning, Usman was surrounded by scholarship. His family were Fulani clerics, respected for their teaching of the Quran and Islamic law. As a young boy, he immersed himself in study. Long before he ever thought of leading an army, he mastered the Quran, learned the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, and explored the deep sciences of theology and jurisprudence. In every sense, he was a scholar first, and his weapon was knowledge. But knowledge alone was not enough. As Usman grew, he saw the world around him slipping into corruption. The Hausa rulers who controlled Gober and other city-states demanded heavy taxes, tolerated practices that clashed with Islamic principles, and cared more for their palaces than for the poor who struggled outside their gates. The rulers lived in luxury while peasants were exploited, while slaves and women suffered without justice. This imbalance weighed heavily on Usman. He did not simply see injustice as politics, he saw it as a failure to uphold divine law. As a teacher and preacher, Usman began to share his message. He called for reform, urging rulers to lead with justice and urging the people to return to a purer form of Islam. His words inspired many. He traveled from village to village, his sermons delivered under trees, in marketplaces, and in mosques. Farmers, traders, women, and even enslaved people gathered to hear him speak. For them, he was not just a scholar but a voice of hope, a man who dared to confront the system that weighed them down. The rulers of Gober, however, saw him as a threat. At first, some tolerated his preaching, even welcoming his knowledge. But as his following grew, the king became wary. Why were thousands listening to Usman instead of their chiefs? Why did his words stir the hearts of peasants, warriors, and scholars alike? The king's suspicion hardened into fear, and fear turned into hostility. By the dawn of the 19th century, Usman's movement was no longer just about words. His followers, men and women from diverse backgrounds, had begun to see themselves as part of something bigger. They believed they were fighting not just for reform but for a future built on justice and faith. The rulers tried to silence him with threats and restrictions. When that failed, Usman and his followers faced open persecution. It was in this moment of crisis that the scholar transformed into a leader of action. In 1804, forced to flee Gober with his followers, Usman declared a jihad. But his jihad was not an act of reckless rebellion. It was a carefully considered struggle to build a society where divine law and justice guided the lives of people. He became not just a preacher but a commander. His white horse carried him to the front lines, his voice rallied men and women alike, and his vision gave them courage. He held the Quran in one hand and raised his sword in the other, reminding his followers that their struggle was for both faith and freedom. That declaration lit the fire of change. The people who once only listened to him now marched behind him. Dust rose from the earth as thousands took up arms, chanting verses, lifting banners, and running toward battle. Usman, once a quiet scholar, now stood at the head of a movement that would sweep across West Africa, overthrowing kings and building one of the largest Islamic states the continent had ever seen, the Sokoto Caliphate. This was only the beginning. The boy from Gober who loved books had become the leader of an army, a teacher turned commander. And the world was about to witness a revolution that would be remembered for centuries. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 2, From Teacher to Commander. When Usman Dan Fodio declared jihad in 1804, he stepped into a role he had never imagined for himself as a young scholar. He was no longer just a teacher who spoke of justice under the shade of village trees. Now he was the commander of a movement, responsible for the lives of thousands of followers who had abandoned their homes and livelihoods to walk with him into the unknown. The scholar's pen and the preacher's words had brought him this far. Now he would have to learn the art of command, strategy, and war. The followers who joined him were a mix of men and women, Fulani herdsmen, Hausa peasants, enslaved people who longed for freedom, and fellow scholars who shared his vision. They were not born soldiers, yet their faith made them strong. Usman inspired them not only with sermons but with action. He reminded them that their struggle was not just against kings and armies but against injustice itself. To his people, the jihad was more than a war. It was a mission to create a community where divine law and fairness ruled. Still, inspiration alone could not win battles. Usman needed to turn this mass of believers into an organized force. With the help of trusted companions, including his brother Abdullahi and his son Muhammad Bello, he began to shape them into an army. He taught discipline, unity, and courage. Spears and swords were sharpened, banners of faith were raised, and chants of the Quran echoed across the camps. Day by day, the group that had fled Gober grew into a disciplined fighting force ready to challenge the Hausa kingdoms. The rulers of Gober watched with alarm. What had started as a preacher's movement had become an armed challenge to their authority. Determined to crush the uprising, the king of Gober sent his warriors to pursue Usman and his followers. The first clashes were fierce. Armed only with simple weapons and fueled by their faith, Usman's people faced the armored cavalry of Gober. In those moments, Usman proved he was more than just a preacher. Though he often rode at the front on his white horse, sword raised, his true strength lay in his ability to command. He rallied his followers with calm authority, reminding them of their purpose. When fear threatened to weaken them, he lifted their spirits with verses of the Quran. When chaos spread in the battlefield, he restored order with clear commands. His words carried more power than any blade. The first battles were costly, but they were also victories. Against the odds, Usman's forces defeated Gober's soldiers. These victories spread quickly across the Hausa states, and with them spread Usman's reputation. No longer was he seen only as a scholar or a critic of kings. He was now a leader capable of standing against the mightiest rulers of the region. As the news traveled, more people joined the cause. Discontented peasants, marginalized communities, and even warriors who had once fought for the Hausa kings began to switch sides. Each victory brought new recruits, and each recruit added strength to the growing movement. The jihad was no longer just a local struggle. It was becoming a revolution that threatened to transform the whole of West Africa. But with growth came responsibility. Usman knew that victory was not just about defeating enemies on the battlefield. It was about building a system that could last. Even as his warriors fought, he continued to teach. He wrote letters and treatises, guiding his followers on the principles of justice, governance, and faith. His camp was as much a school as it was an army base. Soldiers listened to sermons before battle. Scholars debated the laws of governance. Women played vital roles, both as fighters and as teachers. It was this fusion of faith, intellect, and courage that made Usman's movement unique. By 1806, Usman's forces had begun to push deeper into Hausa territory. Kingdoms that once stood unchallenged now trembled. One by one, Hausa rulers either fell in battle or fled their capitals. The armies of Usman, once only a ragtag group of villagers and herdsmen, now carried themselves like a true military force. And at their center was a man who had never sought power for himself, but who embraced leadership because his people demanded it. Standing before his followers after one of their victories, Usman spoke words that stayed with them. "We fight not for wealth or crowns. We fight so that justice may rule, and so that the law of God may guide the hearts of men." His voice, carried by the desert wind, reminded them that theirs was no ordinary rebellion. It was the birth of a new order. The transformation was complete. The boy from Gober who had once studied quietly under his teachers was now a commander of armies. His mission had become unstoppable. And as the banners of the jihad spread further, the dream of a new Islamic state in West Africa was beginning to take shape. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 3, The Flames of Revolution. By 1806, the jihad led by Usman Dan Fodio had grown from a desperate flight from Gober into a sweeping revolution across West Africa. What began as a preacher's defiance against corrupt rulers was now reshaping the political map. The Hausa kingdoms, once secure in their wealth and armies, found themselves shaken by the momentum of a movement they could not suppress. The victories of Usman's followers spread like wildfire. Each success drew in more people who had long suffered under the heavy taxes and injustices of the Hausa elites. Farmers, herdsmen, women, enslaved people, and scholars all saw in Usman a leader who fought for their dignity. His message resonated beyond Gobir. It reached Kano, Katsina, Zaria, and beyond, places where rulers had ignored the cries of their people for too long. At the heart of this revolution was Usman himself. Though he still carried the heart of a scholar, he now bore the responsibilities of a commander and a leader of a nation in the making. His days were divided between strategy and teaching. In the mornings he would ride with his commanders, reviewing the readiness of his fighters. In the evenings, he would write treatises on justice, law, and governance, reminding his followers that their purpose was not conquest for conquest's sake, but the establishment of a just society under divine guidance. The battles became larger as more Hausa kings sought to put down the uprising. Armies clashed on open fields, dust clouds rising as cavalry thundered forward. Usman often rode at the head of his troops, his white horse a symbol of hope for his followers. He commanded with calm clarity, raising his sword not to glorify himself but to rally his people. When fear threatened to break their ranks, his voice rang out with verses of the Quran, giving them courage. One of the turning points came when Usman's forces clashed with the armies of Kebbi and Zamfara. These were not minor skirmishes but full-scale confrontations, with thousands on each side. The Hausa rulers expected their seasoned warriors to crush the insurgents quickly. But Usman's forces, though less equipped, fought with conviction. They ran into battle chanting prayers, their banners raised high. The Hausa cavalry charged, but Usman's men held firm, disciplined and united. Against the odds, the jihadists forced their enemies to retreat, leaving the battlefield in shock. News of these victories traveled fast. Towns and villages began to surrender without resistance, pledging loyalty to Usman. His movement was no longer just a rebellion, it was becoming the foundation of a new state. With each passing month, the Sokoto Caliphate began to take form. New leaders were appointed to govern captured territories, ensuring that justice and Islamic law replaced the old corrupt systems. Scholars traveled alongside soldiers, teaching and advising communities on how to live under the principles Usman envisioned. But victories also brought challenges. Usman knew that power could corrupt, and he constantly reminded his followers that their mission was not personal gain. In his writings, he warned against arrogance and greed. He emphasized humility, justice, and service to the people. These lessons kept his commanders disciplined and prevented the movement from falling into the same patterns of abuse they had risen against. The revolution also brought new roles for women. Figures like Nana Asmayu, Usman's daughter, played vital parts in spreading education. While men fought on the battlefield, women became teachers, writers, and organizers, ensuring that the spiritual and intellectual heart of the movement remained strong. It was this combination of military strength and intellectual depth that made the jihad more than just a war. It was a cultural and social transformation. By the late 1800s, the Sokoto Caliphate had grown into the largest state in West Africa. From Gober to Kano, from Katsina to Nup, vast regions now looked to Usman and his appointed leaders for guidance. The Hausa kings who once dismissed him as a preacher now saw their thrones collapse under the weight of his revolution. And yet, Usman himself remained humble. He often reminded his followers that he was just a servant of God, tasked with guiding them toward a better path. He continued to write, teach, and advise, even as armies fought in his name. To him, the sword and the book were not in conflict. They were partners in building a just society. The flames of revolution were no longer contained to Gobir. They had swept across the Hausa lands, and their light burned brighter with each victory. But even as the Sokoto Caliphate rose, new challenges loomed on the horizon. Powerful enemies still plotted its downfall, and Usman knew that sustaining this new order would require more than courage on the battlefield. It would require wisdom, justice, and the unity of a people bound together by faith. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 4, Building the Sokoto Caliphate. By 1809, the jihad had reached a decisive stage. What began as a scattered resistance against Hausa rulers was now taking shape as a structured state. Victories in battle had given Usman Dan Fodio vast territories, and with them came the responsibility of governance. To simply overthrow kings was not enough. A just and stable system had to be built, one that reflected the principles of faith, fairness, and community that Usman had preached for decades. This was the birth of the Sokoto Caliphate. Usman understood that ruling such a vast and diverse region required more than military strength. Armies could win territory, but only good governance could hold it. He envisioned a state built on Islamic law, but also rooted in justice, scholarship, and service to the people. To achieve this, he delegated power wisely. He appointed trusted leaders to govern different regions, ensuring they were accountable to both him and the divine principles they claimed to uphold. His son, Muhammad Bello, became one of his closest advisors and a key figure in the administration of the caliphate. His brother Abdullahi was also entrusted with leadership, known for his knowledge of law and governance. Together, they formed the backbone of the new state. This system of shared leadership prevented the concentration of power in a single individual and created checks that helped maintain stability. The Sokoto Caliphate soon became more than just a political entity. It was a religious and cultural revolution. Usman encouraged the building of schools and centers of learning in every region under his control. Scholars were given prominence, their voices respected in matters of governance. Education was not reserved for the elite. Women, children, and the poor were included, reflecting Usman's belief that knowledge was the foundation of a just society. His daughter, Nana Asmayu, became a symbol of this vision. She organized networks of female teachers who spread education across the caliphate, ensuring that women played an active role in shaping the intellectual life of the state. Economically, the caliphate brought relief to many who had suffered under Hausa rule. Heavy taxes that had crushed farmers and traders were reduced. Corrupt practices were eliminated. Justice was made accessible through courts that applied Sharia fairly, protecting the weak from exploitation. People who had once lived in fear of rulers now found themselves in a society that respected their dignity and faith. But while the caliphate grew stronger, enemies still surrounded it. Some Hausa rulers continued to resist, forming alliances to reclaim their lost power. External threats also loomed, with neighboring states watching closely. Usman knew that military discipline had to remain sharp. He instructed his commanders to remain vigilant, never allowing the movement to grow complacent. The banners of the jihad still flew across battlefields as warriors defended the expanding frontiers of the caliphate. Even as he commanded armies and governed territories, Usman never abandoned his role as a teacher. He continued to write prolifically, producing works on law, spirituality, and leadership. These writings served as guides not just for his own time but for future generations. His words carried the same authority on paper as his voice did in battle. He reminded his followers that true victory lay not in conquest, but in building a society rooted in justice and guided by faith. One of his most profound teachings was the warning against corruption among leaders. He had fought against the arrogance and greed of the Hausa rulers, and he refused to let his own state fall into the same trap. He wrote, "Do not be like those before you, who oppressed the people and forgot the law of God." His insistence on accountability ensured that his commanders and governors ruled with humility. By this stage, the Sokoto Caliphate had become the largest and most powerful state in West Africa. Its influence spread not just through armies but through ideas. Traders carried its reputation across borders, scholars wrote about its systems, and communities across the Sahel looked to Sokoto as a beacon of justice. And yet, for all the power he commanded, Usman remained modest. He often retreated from the capital to live simply, devoting himself to writing and teaching. In 1815, he even stepped back from active leadership, entrusting authority to his son and brother while he focused on guiding them spiritually and intellectually. This humility set him apart from the rulers he had overthrown. To Usman, leadership was never about glory. It was about service. The foundations of the Sokoto Caliphate were now firmly established. It was a state born from struggle, built on principles, and sustained by the unity of a people who believed in its mission. But the challenges were not over. Internal divisions, external threats, and the constant test of living up to its ideals would soon confront the caliphate. Usman's role as both a guide and a guardian would be more important than ever. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 5, Trials of Unity and Resistance. The rise of the Sokoto Caliphate brought new hope to millions, but it also stirred deep resentment. The rulers who had lost their kingdoms to Usman Dan Fodio's movement were not ready to vanish quietly from history. Defeated Hausa kings regrouped, forging alliances with neighboring states to resist the new power that had risen in the heart of West Africa. At the same time, within the caliphate itself, the rapid expansion tested the loyalty and discipline of its leaders. Victory had been won, but sustaining that victory would be the true challenge. Enemies struck first at the edges of Sokoto's growing territory. Small raids tested the strength of Usman's defenses. In some places, old Hausa leaders tried to reclaim their capitals, hoping that Usman's people were too busy governing to fight back. But they were mistaken. Usman had prepared for this. He reminded his commanders that their struggle was not over, that the jihad had not ended with the fall of the kings. He urged them to remain vigilant and disciplined, never letting comfort weaken their resolve. One of the fiercest battles came against forces from Gobir, the very kingdom where Usman's movement had begun. The exiled leaders of Gobir, bitter at their loss, gathered allies and launched a counterattack. Thousands marched under their banners, determined to crush the caliphate before it grew stronger. When word of the attack reached Usman, he gathered his commanders in council. Calmly he spoke. "This struggle is not for our pride, but for justice. Remember, we fight so that truth may live among the people. Do not falter, for their strength is in their numbers, but ours is in our faith." His words steadied the hearts of his followers. Once again, farmers, herdsmen, and scholars who had become soldiers rallied under his leadership. The battlefield was a storm of dust and steel. Gobir's cavalry charged with thunderous hooves, their spears glittering under the sun. Usman's men stood firm, shields locked, chanting verses as they braced for impact. At the critical moment, Usman rode forward on his white horse, his sword lifted high, calling on his people to advance. Inspired, his army surged ahead, overwhelming the enemy ranks. The forces of Gobir were broken once more, their dreams of reclaiming power shattered. Victory strengthened the caliphate, but Usman knew the real danger was not only from outside enemies. Inside the new state, power and ambition tempted some of his commanders. The caliphate was vast, stretching across lands larger than any single kingdom before it. Governors ruled far-off provinces, and with distance came the risk of disobedience. Some leaders were tempted to rule as kings rather than servants of justice. Usman anticipated this. He had always warned against arrogance and corruption. Now, he took deliberate steps to protect the unity of his movement. He continued to write extensively, producing texts that outlined the duties of rulers, the responsibilities of commanders, and the rights of ordinary people. He reminded his followers that the caliphate was not theirs to exploit but a trust to uphold. In one of his writings he declared, "If you oppress the people, you are no different from those we overthrew." To reinforce these principles, Usman rotated leaders and appointed scholars to watch over governors, ensuring they did not stray from the mission. His daughter, Nana Asmiu, expanded her network of teachers, spreading knowledge and reminding communities that justice and learning were the pillars of the caliphate. Education became both a weapon and a shield, arming people with wisdom so they could resist oppression even within their own society. Despite these efforts, challenges persisted. Some provinces resisted central authority, preferring old traditions over new reforms. Local revolts broke out, forcing the caliphate to send troops to restore order. Usman, though deeply concerned about these cracks, always sought balance. He urged his leaders not to rule through fear but through fairness, teaching that true loyalty came from justice, not force. As external enemies continued their assaults and internal tensions threatened unity, Usman's leadership became the glue holding the caliphate together. His wisdom, humility, and unwavering commitment to principles made him the moral center of the movement. He was both the sword and the voice of reason. His people trusted him not because he demanded loyalty but because he earned it through service. By the end of the first decade of the 19th century, the Sokoto Caliphate had not only survived but strengthened under these trials. Its borders stretched wider, its institutions grew firmer, and its reputation as a state of justice spread across West Africa. Traders carried stories of its fairness, scholars praised its learning, and even enemies admitted the strength of its unity. Yet Usman knew the journey was not complete. He often reminded his people that building a state was not the end but the beginning of a greater struggle. The jihad, he said, was not just a battle fought with swords but a lifelong effort to uphold truth, justice, and humility. The trials of resistance had tested the caliphate, and the trials yet to come would test its soul. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 6, From the Sword to the Pen. By 1810, the Sokoto Caliphate stood as the most powerful state in West Africa. The banners of the jihad flew across vast lands, from Kano to Nupe, from Katsina to Kebbi. Enemies had been defeated, revolts suppressed, and justice restored in many communities. The caliphate was no longer a fragile rebellion but a structured state. And at the heart of it all was Usman Dan Fodio, the scholar who had become a commander, and the commander who was now returning to being a scholar. As the caliphate matured, Usman began to withdraw from the front lines of war. He had led men into battle, rallied armies, and broken the power of kings, but he knew his true gift was not in the sword. His gift was in knowledge, teaching, and guiding hearts. To ensure the stability of the caliphate, he began to delegate more authority to his son Muhammad Bello and his brother Abdullahi. Both men were strong leaders in their own right, Bello with his organizational skills and vision, Abdullahi with his mastery of law and governance. Together they formed the pillars of leadership that carried the caliphate forward. Usman himself stepped into the role of a spiritual guide. He retreated from daily administration and instead devoted his time to writing and teaching. Yet even in his withdrawal, his presence loomed large. He was the conscience of the caliphate, the man who reminded its leaders of their mission and the people of their purpose. His influence ensured that the state did not lose its moral compass. From his retreat, Usman produced some of his most important works. He wrote extensively on justice, governance, and the responsibilities of rulers. His treatises became manuals for leadership, guiding governors, judges, and scholars. He addressed issues like corruption, arrogance, and the need for humility. A ruler who oppresses, he warned, is no different from the tyrants we overthrew. His words carried weight, shaping not only his time but also future generations of leaders. Meanwhile, life in the caliphate began to stabilize. Schools flourished, mosques multiplied, and networks of scholars spread across the land. Nana Asmayu, his daughter, played a crucial role in this cultural flowering. She organized groups of women teachers who traveled to villages, spreading both Islamic knowledge and practical education. This was revolutionary for its time. Women were not only learners but also teachers, ensuring that education reached every corner of society. Through this, the caliphate built an intellectual foundation as strong as its military one. Yet Usman's withdrawal from the battlefield did not mean the caliphate faced no threats. External enemies still tested its borders, and some provinces resisted central control. But now, it was Muhammad Bello and Abdullahi who led the armies, guided by the principles their father had instilled in them. They fought not just with weapons but with the discipline, unity, and faith that Usman had taught from the beginning. The scholar's spirit lived on in every campaign, even if he was no longer physically present. In this period, Usman also emphasized the spiritual heart of the movement. He reminded his followers that jihad was not only a matter of swords and battles. It was also a struggle within, the fight against greed, arrogance, and injustice in the soul. He spoke of purifying the heart, of living humbly, and of serving others. These teachings gave the caliphate depth beyond its political power. It was not only a state of armies and governors, but also a society striving to live by higher values. His humility shone in every decision. Though he was the founder of the caliphate, he did not cling to power. He chose to live simply, often away from the capital, writing and teaching in modest surroundings. He wore plain clothes, ate simple food, and spent his days in prayer, study, and counsel. His retreat was not a weakness but a strength. By stepping aside, he showed that leadership was service, not domination. For the people of the caliphate, this balance of power was inspiring. They saw Muhammad Bello and Abdullahi leading armies and governing with strength, while Usman remained the guiding light, a teacher and sage. This dual leadership model allowed the caliphate to remain strong on the battlefield and steady in its principles. By 1815, Usman had officially handed over political authority to his son and brother, focusing entirely on spiritual and intellectual work. The scholar who once raised his sword on horseback now raised his pen over parchment. His writings would outlast battles, shaping the laws and culture of West Africa for generations. The sword had built the caliphate, but the pen would preserve it. In Usman's mind, this was always the plan: to fight until a just state was born, and then to guide it with wisdom. His withdrawal marked not the end of his leadership but the beginning of a new phase. He had led armies to victory, but now he would lead hearts toward faith and justice. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 7, The Sage of Sokoto. By the second decade of the 19th century, Usman Dan Fodio had transformed from a fiery preacher and commander into the sage of the Sokoto Caliphate. Though he no longer rode into battle or managed the affairs of government directly, his influence was felt everywhere. His son Muhammad Bello and his brother Abdullahi carried the mantle of leadership, but it was Usman's wisdom that guided their decisions. He had built an empire with the sword, but now he preserved it with the pen and with faith. In his final years, Usman lived simply. Despite being the founder of the most powerful state in West Africa, he chose to withdraw from grandeur. He preferred solitude, prayer, and writing to the noise of courts and armies. His home was modest, his clothing plain, and his meals simple. He often reminded his family and students that true leadership was not measured by wealth or titles but by humility and service to God and people. Yet his retreat did not mean silence. From his residence, Usman produced some of his most influential works. He wrote on spirituality, urging believers to purify their hearts from arrogance and greed. He wrote on governance, reminding rulers of their duties to the weak and the oppressed. He even wrote practical guides on law, justice, and social conduct, ensuring that the principles of the caliphate were rooted in knowledge and not just custom. These texts became the backbone of Sokoto's intellectual tradition, studied by scholars across West Africa for generations. One of Usman's strongest legacies was his emphasis on education. He insisted that knowledge must be shared widely, not hoarded by the elite. Under his guidance, schools multiplied across the caliphate, and scholars traveled to teach in towns and villages. Women were included in this revolution of learning, thanks to his daughter Nana Asmayu, who carried forward his vision with unmatched dedication. She organized female teachers who trained others, creating a network that spread knowledge even to the most remote communities. Through this, Usman ensured that women were not silent observers but active contributors to the growth of the caliphate. At the same time, Usman spent much of his energy preparing his successors. He knew that no leader, no matter how great, could rule forever. The survival of the Sokoto Caliphate depended on the strength and wisdom of those who would come after him. To Muhammad Bello, he gave advice on leadership, urging him to be just, patient, and humble. To Abdullahi, he entrusted the role of counselor, guiding the caliphate with law and scholarship. To his family and companions, he gave the responsibility of preserving the spirit of the jihad, ensuring it never became an excuse for tyranny. Even in his later years, people traveled long distances to seek Usman's counsel. Scholars, leaders, and ordinary people all came to hear his words. Sitting before him, they found not a king on a throne but a humble teacher surrounded by books. His voice was calm, his words measured, but his wisdom carried the weight of experience. He had seen kingdoms rise and fall, battles won and lost, and through it all he never wavered from his mission of justice and faith. But age was catching up with him. By 1816, his health began to decline. Though still sharp in mind and spirit, his body grew weaker. He continued to write, teach, and advise, but he spoke often of the fleeting nature of life. To his followers he reminded them that every leader must one day return to God, and that their loyalty should be to justice and truth, not to one man. His humility in the face of mortality inspired those around him to think beyond his lifetime. In his final sermons, Usman spoke of the importance of sincerity in leadership. He warned against the temptation of power, reminding rulers that they were servants, not masters. The true king, he wrote, is not the one who rules men, but the one who rules himself. These words became a cornerstone of his legacy, echoing through the caliphate long after his passing. As his health weakened further, Muhammad Bello and Abdullahi took on full leadership, while Usman retreated almost entirely into prayer and reflection. The caliphate was secure, its foundation strong, and its future in capable hands. Usman had fulfilled his mission, he had fought injustice, built a just state, and left behind leaders and teachings that would outlive him. In the quiet of his final days, Usman Dan Fodio was no longer the warrior on horseback or the fiery preacher of Gobir. He was the sage of Sokoto, a man who had dedicated his life to knowledge, faith, and justice. His legacy was not only in the lands he conquered but in the hearts he transformed. The end of his life was near, but his influence was eternal. The caliphate he founded would endure for nearly a century after his death, and his writings would inspire reformers and leaders for generations. For the people of West Africa, Usman was not just a leader of his time, he was a guide for all time. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 8, The Death of a Leader. In the spring of 1817, a heavy silence settled over Sokoto. News spread quickly that Usman Dan Fodio, the scholar, the preacher, the commander, and the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate, had passed away. The man who had carried the banner of reform, who had led thousands into battle, and who had built the most powerful Islamic state in West Africa, had returned to his creator. For his followers, his death was both a moment of deep sorrow and a call to carry forward his mission. Usman's final days were marked by humility and peace. Weakened by illness, he spent his time in prayer, reflection, and teaching. Even as his body grew frail, his mind and spirit remained strong. He spoke to his family, his students, and his companions, urging them to remain steadfast in their faith and to govern with justice. "Do not let power corrupt you," he reminded them. "For we fought to remove tyranny, not to replace it with another." These last words became part of the moral foundation of the Sokoto Caliphate. When he finally passed, grief swept across the Caliphate. Men and women wept openly in the streets. Scholars recited his writings. Warriors who had once charged into battle at his command bowed their heads in silence. From Kano to Katsina, from Gobir to Gwandu, people mourned the loss of the man who had given them not just a state but also a renewed sense of dignity and purpose. But even in this moment of grief, the transition of power was smooth. Usman had prepared carefully for this day. His son, Muhammad Bello, was recognized as his successor and became the new Sultan of Sokoto. His brother Abdullahi remained a senior leader, guiding governance and law. Together, they carried on Usman's mission, ensuring that the caliphate remained united and strong. Unlike many kingdoms where the death of a founder led to chaos, the Sokoto Caliphate endured, a testament to Usman's foresight. Muhammad Bello was not merely a political successor. He had been trained by Usman from a young age, not only in leadership and governance but also in scholarship and faith. He embodied the values of justice and humility that Usman had preached. Abdullahi, too, provided wisdom and balance, ensuring that decisions remained rooted in knowledge and law. Their leadership reassured the people that though Usman was gone, his vision remained alive. The funeral of Usman Dan Fodio was attended by thousands. Scholars and warriors gathered, women and children came from distant villages, and the people of Sokoto offered their prayers. He was buried simply, in keeping with his own wishes. There was no grand monument or golden tomb. Instead, his true legacy lived in the institutions he had built, the leaders he had trained, and the teachings he had left behind. In the weeks after his death, people turned to his writings for comfort and direction. His books and letters circulated widely, reminding the caliphate of the principles on which it was founded. Imams quoted his works in sermons, judges used his writings to settle disputes, and teachers passed his lessons to new generations of students. Even in death, Usman continued to speak. But his passing also marked a turning point. The Sokoto Caliphate was now in the hands of a new generation. The test ahead was whether they could maintain unity and justice without his direct presence. Enemies watched closely, hoping that his death would weaken the state. But the careful system of governance he had designed, and the shared loyalty to his mission, prevented collapse. Instead, the caliphate emerged from this period stronger, with Muhammad Bello leading confidently and Abdullahi advising wisely. For the common people, Usman's memory remained a source of strength. Farmers who tilled their land remembered his call for justice against oppressive rulers. Traders in the markets remembered his teachings on honesty and fairness. Women, inspired by Nana Asmiu, remembered his support for their education. Warriors remembered his courage and faith in the heat of battle. To them, he was not just a leader of the past but a guide for the present. His death also carried meaning beyond Sokoto. Across West Africa, reform movements looked to him as an example. Leaders in other regions studied his writings and sought to replicate his model of uniting scholarship with power. His influence spread far beyond the borders of the caliphate, shaping the course of Islamic history in Africa. In the end, the death of Usman Dan Fodio did not end his movement. It gave it new life. His passing reminded the people that leaders are mortal, but ideas endure. The Sokoto Caliphate was not built on one man alone but on a vision of justice, knowledge, and faith. That vision survived his death, carried forward by those he had trained and inspired. Thus, the man who began as a humble scholar in Gober ended his journey as one of Africa's greatest leaders. His death in 1817 was not the end of his story, but the beginning of his legacy. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 9, Muhammad Bello and the Burden of Legacy. When the news of Usman Dan Fodio's passing spread in 1817, the Sokoto Caliphate did not collapse into chaos as many outside rulers had hoped. Instead, the mantle of leadership passed to his son, Muhammad Bello. At first, some questioned whether the young leader could fill the enormous shoes of his father. Usman had been a symbol of both scholarship and war, the man who had personally inspired thousands to fight and believe. How could anyone carry such a burden? Yet Muhammad Bello rose to the challenge with calm determination, proving that his father had chosen wisely. Bello's first task was to secure unity. The caliphate was vast, stretching across Hausa and Fulani lands, with dozens of emirates and governors. Loyalty to Usman had been absolute, but would that same loyalty extend to his son? Bello acted quickly to reassure his allies and subordinates. He traveled to key regions, met with leaders, and emphasized continuity. The mission of justice does not end with one man, he told them. It lives in all of us. His ability to combine diplomacy with firm authority held the caliphate together during this fragile period. But unity alone was not enough. Enemies of the caliphate sensed an opportunity. Rival states tested its borders, and local revolts flared in regions that had only recently been subdued. Bello, though a scholar by nature like his father, did not shy away from action. He personally organized military campaigns, leading armies to defend and expand the caliphate. His leadership on the battlefield earned him respect among warriors who had once fought under Usman. Though quieter and less fiery than his father, Bello showed that he had the courage and discipline to command. One of Bello's greatest strengths was his attention to administration. Usman had laid the foundation, but Bello built the structure of governance. He created systems for collecting taxes, distributing resources, and ensuring justice. Under his leadership, the Sokoto Caliphate became not just a coalition of conquered territories, but a functioning state with order and stability. This focus on administration helped secure long-term survival. Bello was also a man of knowledge. He inherited his father's love for scholarship and writing, producing texts on governance, law, and religion. His works continued the intellectual tradition of Sokoto, ensuring that the caliphate was guided by principles rather than personal whims. He emphasized the importance of education, supporting schools and scholars across the land. Like his father, he believed that knowledge was the backbone of justice. Family played a key role in this period of consolidation. Abdullahi Dan Fodio, Usman's brother, remained a trusted advisor and partner in governance. Together with Bello, he provided balance, Bello as the political and administrative leader, Abdullahi as the senior scholar and jurist. Nana Asmiyu also expanded her role, spreading education among women and strengthening cultural unity. This family network ensured that the spirit of Usman's movement did not fade after his death. For the people of Sokoto, the transition from Usman to Bello brought both continuity and change. The vision remained the same, a society rooted in justice, faith, and learning. But the style of leadership shifted. Where Usman had been fiery and revolutionary, Bello was steady and methodical. Where Usman inspired through charisma, Bello led through structure. This balance proved valuable, as it allowed the caliphate to move from its founding struggles into a period of stability and growth. Challenges still existed. Some emirs resisted central authority, preferring independence. Borderlands required constant defense against raids and rival states. Bello responded with patience and persistence, using both diplomacy and force when necessary. His careful leadership ensured that Sokoto's borders expanded, and its authority solidified. By the 1820s, the caliphate stood not as a fragile coalition but as a true empire, respected and feared across West Africa. Perhaps Bello's greatest achievement was preserving his father's legacy without becoming lost in it. Many sons of great men either failed to live up to the legacy or abandoned it entirely in search of their own glory. Bello did neither. He honored his father's vision while shaping it for a new era. The Sokoto Caliphate under his leadership remained deeply tied to Usman's ideals but also developed into a structured state capable of lasting beyond one generation. In the eyes of the people, Bello was not merely the son of Usman. He became a leader in his own right, one who balanced scholarship with governance, faith with pragmatism, and justice with strength. His leadership proved that the Sokoto Caliphate was not just the creation of one extraordinary man, but a movement with the power to endure. By the end of his early reign, it was clear, the death of Usman Dan Fodio had not ended the caliphate. Instead, it had entered a new chapter, guided by Muhammad Bello, strengthened by Abdullahi, and enriched by the contributions of Nana Asmiyu. The flame Usman had lit burned on, carried by those who believed in his vision. The Rise of Usman Dan Fodio, Chapter 10, A Legacy Beyond Time. The death of Usman Dan Fodio in 1817 marked the end of a remarkable life, but it was not the end of his story. In truth, his influence only grew stronger after his passing. The Sokoto Caliphate, guided by his son Muhammad Bello, his brother Abdullahi, and his daughter Nana Asmiyu, carried forward his vision with energy and discipline. What Usman had built was not a fragile rebellion, nor a fleeting empire held together by force. It was a movement rooted in ideas, knowledge, and justice, and those things outlive any single man. Under Muhammad Bello, the caliphate expanded and stabilized. Abdullahi provided wisdom as a jurist and counselor, ensuring that governance stayed true to Islamic principles. Nana Asmiyu spread knowledge far and wide, empowering women and building networks of education that endured for generations. Together, they made sure that Usman's dream of a society rooted in faith and fairness continued to thrive. But Usman's legacy stretched beyond Sokoto's borders. His writings circulated across West Africa, inspiring reformers from Senegal to Chad. Leaders studied his treatises on justice, governance, and spirituality, using them as guides for their own societies. In many ways, Usman became more than a local leader. He became a model for Islamic reform across the continent. His words were quoted in mosques, his principles adopted by scholars, and his vision imitated by rulers far beyond his homeland. The caliphate itself endured for nearly a century, lasting until the arrival of European colonial powers in the late 19th century. Even when colonialism broke the state apart, the spiritual and intellectual legacy of Usman lived on. The descendants of his family continued to hold authority in northern Nigeria, and the memory of his jihad remained a powerful source of identity and pride. To this day, the Sultan of Sokoto is regarded as the spiritual leader of Muslims in Nigeria, a position that traces directly back to Usman Dan Fodio. Perhaps the most remarkable part of his legacy was his insistence on education and justice. In a time when women were often excluded from learning, Usman ensured that his daughter Nana Asmayu became one of the most influential scholars of her era. Through her, generations of women gained access to knowledge. His teachings on fairness in leadership, humility in power, and responsibility toward the poor became guiding principles not only in Sokoto but across West Africa. Usman's life was a balance of opposites. He was a warrior who preferred peace, a leader who lived simply, and a revolutionary who valued continuity. He fought to overthrow tyranny, but he refused to replace it with personal luxury or absolute power. Instead, he chose to retire from politics, leaving leadership to his successors while devoting himself to writing and teaching. In doing so, he showed that true greatness lies not in holding power forever, but in preparing others to lead after you. Even centuries later, his name carries weight. In modern West Africa, Usman Dan Fodio is remembered as both a religious reformer and a state builder. For Muslims, he stands as a model of piety, courage, and scholarship. For historians, he is one of Africa's greatest leaders, a man who combined vision with action and transformed an entire region. For communities in Nigeria and beyond, his memory is a reminder that justice and knowledge are the foundations of lasting strength. The Sokoto Caliphate may no longer exist as a political state, but its cultural and spiritual heritage remains alive. Mosques, schools, and traditions founded in his time continue to shape the lives of millions. His writings are still studied, his teachings still quoted, and his principles still relevant. In every sermon that calls for justice, in every classroom that welcomes students, in every leader reminded of humility, the legacy of Usman Dan Fodio breathes on. As history looks back on his life, it becomes clear that his greatest achievement was not the battles he won or the territories he controlled. It was the vision he left behind, a vision of a society guided by faith, strengthened by knowledge, and anchored in justice.